Excellent.
Good morning, Prof. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
It's so sad that you can't join us. We're looking forward to have coffee with you this morning.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate the invite. I'm just trying to. We had the same problem with Teams the last time, that it won't allow us to share our screens. But let me quickly see if I can get that sorted.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure if it's a university thing, firewall thing, or what. Slideshow. What can you see on your side?
Yeah. Yeah. Your screen, Prof.
Yeah. So you see making sense of genetic errors. You see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad.
We're winning.
We're winning. This is better than it was the last time.
Thanks to Michelle.
Don't want to stop. I want to take this little thing away. Do you see what I want to take away?
The mouse.
No, I want to take away this little pop-up screen. Can you see it on your side?
Bicycle.
Your room. I see all of you sitting around a table there.
Yes, I don't know how Prof can minimize that. So it's sitting in the corner of your presentation. Is that what you see?
But that's good, yeah. So you can see the presentation.
Yeah, but Prof doesn't want to see us.
Oh.
I understand it's popping up on his screen.
Yeah, so it's on my side, so I can't see my full presentation, but it's okay. Let me
Our camera off. Just see, Prof. We're quickly gonna remove it. Just let us know.
Okay.
Is it better?
I want to see if I can take you out of the way. There, you're moving around now. And if I click on minimize, it doesn't minimize. So I'll have to deal with you. That's okay.
You done? Okay. Just checking.
So I'm going to stop share just for a moment until we get going. And I see Mareike is there.
Yes.
Mareike?
Good morning.
It's good to see you
André?
again. Hoe gaan dit?
Yes. Dit gaan goed. Ek is nog hier, maar dit voel soos 'n vorige lewe toe ek nog pediatrie gedoen het. En almal dink ek weet nog alles en dit is nie so nie.
Mareike, het jy al grys geword? Ek kan nie mooi sien nie.
Ek dink nie ek share hoe ek lyk nie. Ek is pierwit.
Ek is
'n tannie. Ek is 'n tannie.
Is jy 'n tannie? So.
Ja, ek is 'n ou tannie.
Ag, maar dis goed om jou weer te sien. You guys know Mareike was, I think, my junior registrar at one stage, and she was brilliant. She was one of the best registrars ever. And I can't believe that I now can believe that she decided to become a pathologist. I think it was a great move, Mareike.
Thank you. You are very generous, André. I was hardworking, and that's where I stopped. Yeah, no. At school, I am asked if I'm my daughter's granny. It happens very frequently.
Asked if you're your daughter's granny. Shame.
Yeah. Finally, we meet Lisa's granny.
Well, fortunately, I don't go to school with my kids.
I have to correct him and say I'm just the old mother. Yes. Well, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks.
All right, let's start. Thank you. Welcome, Mareike and Prof. We're very happy to have you. Leanne's going to introduce you to our audience. Let's get this started. We're excited to hear from you, Prof.
Good morning, everybody. Today we have Professor Andre van Niekerk presenting to us. He is a pediatrician and pediatric pulmonologist with a special interest in clinical immunology. Excuse me, my voice. He previously served as a chairperson of the Allergy Society of South Africa and currently leads their Primary Immune Deficiency Diseases Interest Group, PIDDSA. He helped to establish the Allergy and Clinical Immunology Foundation of South Africa as one of its founding members. Dr. van Niekerk spent most of his career in private practice, but remained closely involved in academic circuits. He assisted in setting up the clinical service for primary immunodeficiency diseases at the University of Pretoria and was awarded an extraordinary professorship. He has since returned to full-time academic work and now holds the University of Pretoria AMPATH Chair for Inborn Areas of Immunity and Allergology. He also serves on the boards of the South African Society for Immunodeficiencies and the South African Immunology Society, and is the co-director of the University of Pretoria FOCIS Centre of Excellence for Clinical Immunology. We are very privileged to have you speak and give us a talk today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And for some reason, it doesn't want to advance now. The slides doesn't want to advance.
Maybe Prof share it again, just see.
Stop sharing. And then let's share it. Let me just see if I don't share, if I can advance it. Yes, I can, but you can't see anything now, no? You can't see anything. Yeah, so if I don't share, I can advance.
And there should be a button underneath that you could actually choose.
But let's... It now wants me to upload it onto OneDrive and all sorts of things. Maybe what I'm going to do quickly, if you give me a moment, I'm going to turn it into a PDF and see if I can just scroll through a PDF, if you don't mind. So let me just quickly print it as a PDF. The same thing happened the other day when we did the Wits thing with Teams. It works if you do it on another platform, but with Teams it doesn't work. So let me quickly print it as a PDF on my desktop. It's done. And let me quickly go to my desktop and open it as a PDF. Okay, and let me see if I now try and share. Share. Okay, what are you seeing now? Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you see that? Okay, so I'm going to just scroll through this. I apologize, it won't be animated. So first of all, you've heard that I am the AMPATH chair, so if I say too much about pathology, then take that as a bias. What I wanted to do is just give you an introduction to IEI. What is the inborn errors of immunity? Unfortunately, they call it IEI globally. That's a new term that was coined 5 years ago by the IUIS, the International Society for International Union of Immune Societies. We object to that because it creates the impression that it's a pediatric problem, and it's not a pediatric problem. So we want the idea of calling it genetic errors of immunity. And I think COVID taught us that. You know, when COVID happened, all of us were exposed to a new germ, and look at the diverse clinical manifestations that we saw. You know, so it's about genetic errors of immunity. Then quickly share with you the blood works that we should do. Say a word about genetic sequencing, because this is a genetic error of immunity. And if you've got time, just briefly touch on immunoglobulin replacement therapy, because that's the most common way of treating many of these patients. So just to remember, what is IEI? It is genetically determined. It's a defect in one or more than one of your components of your immune system. And it doesn't only result in loss of function. We see it as loss of function. You know, you get more infections, but that's not true. It's also about a gain of function that you don't want. And it's also about loss of tolerance and loss of regulation. So, but, and you know, you can have one mutation and present with all these in at different stages of your disease process. So very often your immune deficiency starts with severe eczema, for example, as a baby. So it results in an increased susceptibility to either a broad spectrum of infections, different pathogens that make you sick, but we also have those genetic mutations that result in a single pathogen repeatedly, like TB. There's a Mendelian susceptibility for TB. And these patients just get TB over and over and over, and complicated TB. But together, and often at the same time or at a different stage, manifestations of allergy, of autoimmunity. So the patient that comes in with ITP could actually be an IEI patient, or presents with malignancy. We just had a case of a 14-year-old with common variable immune deficiency, and he's never had infections. He came in with his lymphoma. That was his presenting manifestation. So the idea is that we must forget about the silos of allergy, immune deficiency, malignancy, and autoimmunity, and we must see the link. And especially if you see a patient that presents with more than one of these manifestations, the allergy that doesn't get better on allergy treatment, think of the possibility that that sinusitis is not just allergy, that there's actually an inborn error of immunity underlying to that. So the important thing is that II is more than just that susceptibility to infections. It's also about these other forms of immune dysregulation. And this is just to give you an idea on what we mean with this continuum. Over here, you've got a list of genetic mutations that we encounter on a regular basis. I've had a STAT3 gain of function mutation in the practice the other day. And look how these patients present clinically. They can present with their thyroid disease, and they can present with their autoimmune hemolytic anemia. This patient that I'm talking about had autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but at the same time, an increased risk to infection, because this one gene is involved in both causing autoimmune manifestations as well as infections. So forget about the silos. That's message number one. The next message is that we previously thought that these conditions are rare, but we now know that they are not rare. And the reason why we thought they were rare is because we didn't have such eloquent genetic sequencing than what we've got now. It's only been the last 10, 15 years. So at the moment, there are more than 600 defined inborn errors of immunity. These are single gene mutations. But they are also quite a big group, and as a pulmonologist, you're going to see mostly those without a single mutation. So there are patients with not only single mutations, and the current prevalence in a USA study is about 1 in 1,200 live births. So if you compare that to the situation that we're facing as pulmonologists, cystic fibrosis is far more rare than the inborn errors of immunity. The aggregate prevalence is around 1 in 400 to 1 in 1,000 births. 1 in 400, they're usually not that sick, but if you look for them, you find them. And I wanted to just tease you a bit. This is a data set, and I want to ask you, what are you seeing in your practice on a daily basis? This is a data set of almost 3,000 patients who are already diagnosed. They've got a diagnosis. And look at their frequency for severe infections measured here as hospital admissions. And you will see that more than 30% were not hospitalized before they were diagnosed. 30% of them were never hospitalized. So if you're only thinking IEI in terms of hospitalization, then you're going to miss a heck of a lot of these patients. They come to our rooms, not necessarily to our hospital beds. Same study. How old are they? And this is the point I wanted to make. We think because it's an inborn error of immunity, it must be a child or a baby. And it's true that the majority of them are diagnosed around about 5 years of age, in the first 5 years of life. But more than 40% are not diagnosed until adulthood. And why is that? That is for two reasons. One is delayed diagnosis. They are not being diagnosed because we don't think of it. In the US, there's a study that showed that the average delay in diagnosis is 12 years. We recently had an adult in Joburg. When we looked back, he was 26 years old at age of diagnosis. And when we looked back at previous blood works, he's been sick for more than 10 years. 10 years ago, his basic liver function test already showed that he had an IEI. So the delay in diagnosis is around about 12 years. That's one reason. But the other reason is, like with malignancy, like with the BRCA gene, for example, some of these mutations only manifest in later life. What do they look like in terms of their infections? We think they must have sepsis. And that's actually not true. They come in with sinusitis. That's the most common manifestation, is sinusitis. Second most common, bronchitis, and especially chronic bronchitis. This patient, adult with a chronic wet cough, is there. Pneumonia and repeated pneumonia. Otitis media, that's very common. And if you see otitis media in a patient of 6 years old or 12 years old or 10 years old, you must really worry about an inborn error of immunity. Diarrhea is quite a common thing. And then you've got those other manifestations that I've mentioned, malignancy, etc. So we're trying to convince, as PITSA, as the Primary Immune Deficiency Working Group of South Africa, that we should think about these conditions because they are under our nose, but we're not considering them. And we use the acronym SPIR. And this is lucky in South Africa because we all know SPIR in South Africa, but it actually comes from Europe. It was coined first in Frontiers of Immunology. And SPIR is an acronym that says any patient that presents with infections that are more severe than expected, more persistent than expected, more unusual than expected, or more recurrent than expected should be considered as a IEI patient. And unusual also adds unusual malignancy, unusual autoimmunity, unusual allergy. And especially if you see these things together with SPIR, frequent lymphopenia. If you look at that full blood count and you see there's a frequent lymphopenia or neutropenia, you should worry. This is very handy in adults, a calculated globulin. If you simply look at the full blood, at the liver function and protein minus albumin is small. In other words, you get a calculated globulin of 20 or 18 or 20. You should really worry about this patient. The patient that I'm speaking about, that we recently diagnosed at the age of 26. His calculated globulin 10 years ago was 11. So really think about the possibility. Family history, I think in adults that should have been sorted out already, but chronic mucopurulent secretions, these patients with snot sinuses and chronic wet cough, we must worry about them. Of course, these other things, no tonsils, absent tonsils, glands that are too big or glands that are not palpable when you think they should be there. Most likely in adult patients, less of a problem, but syndromic feature. Any syndromic feature must make you worry about it. Poor dentition must make you worry about it. Autoimmune disease in an adult, always think of the possibility of an IEI, and skin rashes that you struggle to explain should also make you worry. The skin is an immune organ. And then if you have SPIR plus ribs, you order SPIR ribs. RIBS is an acronym for return in bad shape. So you think you've got a diagnosis, you're treating it, he's got sinusitis because of allergy, you're treating the allergies, but the patient returns in bad shape. So always think of the possibility of an IEI. So I hope I've managed to convince you it's not rare, you should look for it, and that it's the common things that we are seeing in our practice. If it's just too much, too often, too severe, too complicated, and your gut says worry about this, then you should worry. Now, I said there are at the moment about 600 of these conditions. The IUIS is now the custodian of the registry of these conditions. They are classified according to the segment of the immune system that's affected. There are 10 segments and 10 tables. They are classified according to the segment of the immune system that's affected. And this is important. Each of the 10 tables comes with its unique type of infections. It comes with, and those infections are often the signature. You get TB over and over and over. That's a signature that will guide you towards which one of the 10 tables. Each one of them come with its own type of autoimmunity associated with it, allergy associated with it, and malignancy associated with it. Now, this is last year's update published this year. So at this stage, 572, but they've added another 20 in the meantime. Many of these conditions are individually rare, but the aggregate is common, and some of them are very common, like the antibody deficiencies, 1 in 400 in the population. So as you look at this discovery, how has it happened over the years? You can literally see that it was quiet. Now, and then suddenly you get this boom. We are in this boom. And this boom is relentless at the moment with new technology, DNA-based technology. We're just finding more and more of these conditions at the moment. These are the 10 tables. And the ones I've underlined in red is the ones that I think as an adult pulmonologist, you will be dealing with most frequently. The combined immune deficiencies, very often you'll inherit them from the pediatricians, and we really struggle. I promise you, I've got 23-year-old patients in the practice. The university has a private clinic at Waterfall City, and we can't get rid of these patients because we can't find doctors for them, adult doctors for them. They often know more about their own disease than their doctors. And that's part of the problem is that they worried, who will understand them. Then the next one that I think you will see is the antibody deficiencies, and that should make up 60% of your PID cases, predominant antibody deficiencies. They're actually the easy group to work with. Then the congenital defects of the phagocytes, those are the neutrophil defects mostly. And I know for sure that there are 2 or 3 of these patients floating around in the adult pulmonology community. And complement deficiencies, especially MBL deficiency, is something that you will commonly encounter. Now, I just selected 3 of them. We're not having time to go through 600, and I won't be able to go through 600, but these are the ones I think we are missing in adult pulmonology practice. The first one is this one, and it is an antigen-specific antibody deficiency, or we call it shortly abbreviated SAD, a specific antibody deficiency. 1 in 10 patients that you're investigating for problematic sinopulmonary infections will suffer from this. So patients who actually come to a specialist and say, I struggle with my sinuses and my otitis media, and very common in children, I don't know how common in adults, a chronic wet cough because they've got protracted bacterial bronchitis. So 1 in 10. So this is really common. They are patients with an inability to produce specific antibodies against encapsulated microbes. So Pneumococcus Haemophilus moraxella. Those patients who come in with those infections repeatedly, they can't produce those antibodies. Or if they do produce those antibodies, it rapidly wanes. It doesn't last. So this is a B cell problem. And I'll briefly say something about that. To diagnose it, you must have an insufficient vaccine response to a polysaccharide antigen, in other words, Pneumovax 23. That's the only pure polysaccharide antigen vaccine in South Africa. So if you give them Pneumovax 23, they must have a deficient response to that Pneumovax 23. They must have a normal response to protein antigens. We use tetanus. So and why is that? The B cell is needed for polysaccharide responses. You need T cells for protein responses. Of course, B as well, but T helper cell for protein responses. And then they usually have a normal IgG and A and M. So if you only test that, you're going to miss the failed vaccine response and often even a high IgG because they've got chronic infection. And because they've got chronic infection, the IgG is often high. So if you don't check their vaccine response to Pneumovax, you're not going to diagnose them. And they usually have normal IgG subclasses. Sometimes IgG2 may be low, but usually normal subclasses, and very often associated allergy. So they come to us with our allergy and their sinusitis, and we treat the allergy and it doesn't respond, but they've actually got a deficient vaccine response to polysaccharides. So I'll quickly say something about that during the blood test as well. This is another common one that I think we are missing in these patients with a chronic wet cough, and that is an MBL deficiency. And if you remember correctly, the complement path is activated by 3 possible arms, the classic path, the alternative path, and that's in any case always active. And then an important one here, the mannan binding lectin path, mannose binding lectin. What is that? That's sugar. And where do we find this? Polysaccharide. So on our polysaccharide antigens, we've got this sugary molecule part of the capsule, and that activates mannan binding lectin. And if you don't have mannan binding lectin, then your lectin path is not activated, and it is critical for eliminating encapsulated bacteria, once again, Haemococcus moraxella. What's the carrier status? Is up to 30% of the population. Many of these patients are heterozygous, and therefore they're not really symptomatic. If they're homozygous, they are usually symptomatic and their MBL is undetectable. And on its own, it could be fine to struggle with this problem. The oldest patient we've diagnosed was 84. And she presented with recurrent dental abscesses and she lost her teeth throughout her life, but nobody ever could explain why she's losing her teeth. But if you've got this MBL deficiency and you also have a SAD, then you're in trouble. Or if you also have a selective IgA deficiency, then you've got in trouble, and it's commonly associated. Or if you've got the IgG2 subclass deficiency, but both of them could be not enough to really put you into a disease bracket. But if you add the two, it's a modifier gene. If you've got a cystic fibrosis patient, even a heterozygous cystic fibrosis carrier, plus an MBL deficiency, they are far more severe in terms of their phenotype. So keep that one in mind. And then this is the one that you definitely see the most, and that is common variable immune deficiency. The onset is usually in adulthood, mostly. Only about 25% of them present in childhood. The patient I told you about with a globulin fraction of 11, he presented at around 15 years of age, and he was diagnosed at 26 years of age. So most of them young adults, when they present, boys and girls equally, and it's common and it's variable, and therefore their clinical presentation is it's really heterogeneous. They can present in so many different ways, usually recurrent sinopulmonary infections, often diarrhea. Giardia lamblia is a typical presentation that they've got, is Giardia. But many of them present first with their autoimmune disease or with malignancy even. The one that I just spoke about presented with lymphoma. That was the primary presentation. Very often gastrointestinal unhappiness, non-specific abdominal pain, but they can present with lymphoma and gastric carcinoma at a younger age. So if you see gastric carcinoma at a younger age, this is typically how they present. they've got a set of diagnostic criteria that must be adhered to. Low IgG, always low, and always either low IgA or IgM. It could be any one of the two, or both. When you look at their B cells, it must be present. They have normal B cell numbers, and they, once again, don't respond to Pneumovax 23 as they should be responding. So you can see how important this Pneumovax 23 test is becoming. And normal T cell subsets and normal T cell function. So basically, if you see that, plus IgA low, IgG low, and a poor vaccine response, and add a bit of autoimmunity, then you've got a diagnosis with these patients, and they really need attention because they turn into bronchiectasis if you don't follow them well. So if you now think you've got a patient with a possible inborn error of immunity, what should you do as baseline in terms of investigations? And we've just published a chapter in the new handbook, the ALSA handbook, where we suggest that think SPUR, and if you're thinking SPUR, do at least the following. Step 1, remember that secondary immune deficiencies are more common than primary immune deficiencies, and therefore we should know the HIV status of the patient, at least put a urine dipstick in the urine. Because if there's protein loss in the urine, or if there's chronic diarrhea with the protein losing state, remember that will push down your IgG. IgA will not be affected, but IgG will go down. So think of the secondaries. Calculated globulin, at least check that. But do these basics. The one other thing that I think we overseeing in the private sector is oral corticosteroid use. We get a lot of patients referred, children, for workup on PID, IAI, and then if you just take the history, the child has had 6 courses of oral steroids in the past year. That is a reason for a secondary immune deficiency if a patient had 6 courses of oral steroids. But this is your basic blood works that you should do. So first of all, just look at the full blood count and get a good cumulative report. Just follow that neutrophil count. What was it like over time? Look at the lymphocyte count. That's the most helpful one. Even a marginally decreased lymphocyte count repeatedly should worry you. A very low lymphocyte count, if your lymphocyte count, even during acute illness, goes below 1 and very specifically below 0.6, you should really worry about the possibility of an underlying IEI. The platelet count can often help because of autoimmunity. And then you know, of course, of Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome, where the platelet count is usually low. Do gain IgG, M, A, and E. E is not an allergy test. E is immunoglobulin that you should have. And very often we see absent E. And absent E gives you the same phenotype as absent A. And it tells you the B cells are not class switching as they should be class switching. So do all that. Add to your CD4 and 8 count a CD3. That's your total T cell count. You know CD4 is the helper cell, T helper cell, and the cytotoxic T cell, CD8. CD19 is the B cell. Here we want to see the B cells as well, and of course the NK cells. So this is all first line. And then the other first line is, what is the tetanus antibody baseline? And what is the pneumococcal serotype specific IgG baseline? Marika, I'd like to talk to you afterwards about pneumococcal serotype specific IgG. We often do total pneumococcal, overall pneumococcal antibody. That is useless in the context of diagnosing an immune deficiency. It must be the serotype specific IgG. In other words, we want to know the 23 serotypes that's in the vaccine, because we're going to use the vaccine to measure the B cell response when we revaccinate the patient to do the vaccine response test. And just remember that IgG subclasses are not first-line investigations. They seldom add clinical value. We seldom do them. And IgG subclasses are very variable. They disease state dependent. So if you do IgG subclasses in an admitted sick patient, it's in any case a useless test to do. So we don't do that. But let's just look at the same group of tests and quickly just say why do we do these as first line investigations? So the ones in the top bracket there is counting. We've got enough IgG, we've got enough CD4 cells, we've got enough CD19 cells. This is just counting the quantity. And of course, if the quantity is lacking, we're worried. Or if the quantity is too much, like you've got IgG of 2000, then you know there's immune dysregulation. Or if, for example, you've got high IgM, but the others are low, then you know that high IgM is a warning. The B cells are not class switching. Remember, all B cells, when they're babies, produce IgM. And as they are activated, they class switch to IgG and IgA. And if you've got a low IgG and a low IgA and a high IgM, you should really worry. There's a B cell problem here. So just counting the numbers, you learn a lot from the numbers. And then the vaccine responses, tetanus, protein, pneumococcus polysaccharide. Why do we do that? That is because we intend to. The baseline is not of relevance. It's the vaccine response. We intend to give tetanus vaccine. We intend to give Pneumovax 23. 4 weeks later, we're going to measure again tetanus, and we're going to measure the pneumococcal serotypes. And that tells us whether the T helper cells are working, because tetanus needs T helper cells and pneumococcus needs B cell function, whether the T cells are working and whether the B cells are working as they should if they are exposed to a very specific antigen. And if you then measure it another 6 months down the line and it's all gone lost again, the vaccine response, then you've got immune memory failure. So I hope that makes sense to you why we do these two groups of basic tests. And just quickly about this pneumococcal vaccine response and tetanus vaccine response. So I've already said it. Tetanus is T helper cell, T helper cell dependent, and Pneumovax is T helper cell independent. In other words, totally B cell reliant. How does my B cells work? How do my B cells work? How do my T helper cells work? So where will I typically do the response? If I think it's a combined immune deficiency, the T cells are involved, then I will do the tetanus response. And it's so cheap to do it in any case. We usually do it in any case. But especially these patients that come to the pulmonologist with a chronic otitis media, sinusitis, bacterial bronchitis, invasive pneumonia, they are the patients who must have a B cell response test, because that's where our antibodies come from against the polysaccharides. So typically, I've said it already, you measure the baseline, vaccinate, 4 weeks later, retest the patient. Must be done on the same lab platforms because all the lab platforms are not comparable. And then you will get 2 patterns of non-response. Either you will have a non-response to both tetanus and pneumococcus, and that non-response is a big warning that you've got a combined immune deficiency. T cells are sick and B cells are sick, or T cells especially. And if you've got tetanus responding well, but Pneumovax is not responding, you've got a B cell disease in your patient. And this is just quickly the algorithm. What is the response that we want? We measure the baseline. To be protective in a child under 6, at least 50% of that 23 pneumococcal serotypes must be protective, and in an adult, at least 70% must be protective. Now, if it's at baseline normal, and that could be because the patient was recently vaccinated, then it's a good idea to maybe just wait a while before you do it. But if you really think there's an immune deficiency, even if the baseline is normal, you still measure the response. You still vaccinate them and you still measure the response. So you give the vaccine, and we've discussed them already. 4 weeks later, you rebleed, and I'll show you practically how you now count it. From tetanus, you want at least a 4-fold increase. Your baseline was 2, your baseline must now be above 5. You want at least a 4-fold increase with tetanus because it's T helper cell dependent. With pneumococcus, in the adult patient, there must be a 2-fold increase from baseline. You look at each one of those 23 lines. There must be a 2-fold increase from baseline. They must be protective in at least 70% of serotypes. I'll show you now. So if they responded well, but you really think there's an immune deficiency, you need to repeat it in 6 to 12 months to see if there's waning, rapid waning. And if it was not good, the response, it puts you firmly on the path of a diagnosis. And I just want to show you this one case. This is a 16-year-old with recurrent chronic bronchitis. It's bacterial. Look at the pathogens. This is a signature, Haemophilus, Moraxella, Haemophilus. This is polysaccharide. So we worried about the response of the B cells. We're going to give the patient Pneumovax after baseline, but this is the patient's baseline. And I'm now worried because the animations are not going to work yet. But this is baseline. And in this baseline, you can see that those ones that are yellow are the ones that are already non-protective. They are below the normal value, and at baseline, we don't really bother because we now need to see what the response is. And unfortunately, this is now something that must unmask. And in this case, after vaccination, there's a result 2 column here that you now can't see. After vaccination, one of the 23 was still yellow. It didn't increase at all. It was, you take all the ones that was still not protective and count them. So 1 out of 23 in this case was still non-protective. And then out of the 23 after the vaccine, there was 1 that did not double. It was protective, but it did not double. And because it did not double, so let's say it was this one, it was 1.33 and it was now 1.9. It didn't double, but it's protective. It's still a fail. So you count all the fails, you add up all the fails, and the fails in this case gave us a 9% failed response. In other words, there was a 91% response. This is a 16-year-old. We at least wanted 70% to respond. So it was a successful response in the case of this case. But we were worried because there are symptoms here. So we repeated it after 6 months, and there's a third column that you can't see. And after 6 months, 16 out of the 23 were yellow again. So that was non-protective. 16 out of the 23 within 6 months was non-protected. 1 out of the 23, and you can't see it unfortunately, was protective, but it wasn't twice anymore. It didn't have the double increase anymore. So that's why it was also a fail. And that means 17 out of 23 failed. And in this patient's case, after 6 months, it was a 74% failed response. And therefore, only 26% were protective. After 6 months, we still want 70% protective of the 23. And therefore, this patient has a SAD, specific antibody deficiency, with a waning phenotype. So I'm sorry about the animations that didn't work here, but I hope you get the idea of how you calculate these things. Just a quick word. I'm going to give time. I want to rush a bit so that I can rather chat to you than lecture. It doesn't work to lecture. The value of genetic sequencing. Remember that we are talking here about 600 single gene mutations. And if the patient suffers from one of that 600 single gene mutations, then genetic sequencing is actually a shortcut. And that's why it's already globally now standard of care to do genetic sequencing. It's got definite advantages, and we don't have time today, but I wanted to show you some examples. We've just had a kid, 8 years old, with 4 sets of grommets. That's already a warning. And his IgM was high, IgG was low, IgA was low. I thought he had an hyper IgM syndrome, and then he didn't respond to tetanus. And remember what I said, tetanus is T cell. So we were really worried about his T cells, and we genetically sequenced him, and he came back as a confirmed X-men syndrome. And X-men, X-linked, and men stands for magnesium, E stands for Epstein-Barr virus, and N for neoplasia. So in this kid with repeated grommets, I did not in my wildest dream expect EBV, and I did not expect malignancy. So the moment we got the definitive genetic diagnosis, we sonoed him, and he had a 5-centimeter gland in his porta hepatis. He had lymphoma, and nobody was worried about his lymphoma. We were worried about his grommets that he was getting. So genetic sequencing can very often give you a definite diagnosis long before the patient actually clinically manifests. It gives you an idea of prognosis. It gives you an idea of what to screen. Now go and do an abdominal sonar. Now go and measure EBV viral load. And it's very nice to know it when you consider stem cell transplant, because for many of these patients, a stem cell transplant is the only value. But as you know, genetic sequencing has a problem. We get those variants of unknown significance that we still don't know what they mean. You need genetic counseling. Did you know that you need informed consent, like for HIV? I must say we slip up on that. And you need to always integrate the clinical picture with the genetic results that you got. And of course, cost is an issue. Don't know if you want to hear anything about immunoglobulins, but you should know that especially those patients with a humoral immune system problem, with infections, that for them they need immunoglobulin replacement. You know that there are different products on the market. IV, we've got 5%, 10%, there's a 3% also. SCIG, subcutaneous, this is what I wanted to mention. To administer immunoglobulins, you can never do it IMI. The once a month intramuscular is a sin. It doesn't do anything. But IVI monthly, and then the one that we neglect, and it's actually the best one, is subcutaneous replacement that's done weekly at home. And just remember, in immune deficient patients, if you don't have venous access, then you can't put in a port. Ports are not allowed in immune deficient patients. You need to swap them from intravenous to subcutaneous. And just to show you what's the difference between intravenous and subcutaneous, this is a Bruton patient with no B cells. And if you give them intravenous, every intravenous infusion gives you a spike. The dotted line here is our target. Every intravenous gives you a spike. And as you can see, within 14 days, you're already going below your target, and you get this washout period where the patient is actually vulnerable. If you take that same dose and you split it into 3, and instead of 30 grams once off, whatever your dose is, equivalent dose, but you give it subcutaneously every week, then that's what you get. You don't have the wasted spike, and you don't have this washout period where you go below. So it's far more effective than intravenous. It's done at home. The patients do it themselves, and they do it once a week. This is what it looks like. You can have up to 4 needles in subcutaneously at a time. We normally, in the bigger children, only use 2 needles at a time, and they literally can put their own needles subcutaneously, and they literally infuse themselves. It's got less systemic side effects, and it's more effective. So just keep that in mind. And if they don't want to use a syringe and a butterfly, there are these pumps available where they can put it on and they can infuse themselves with a pump. Finally, this I think is really a handy table. If you don't have a definitive diagnosis, you don't have a genetic confirmation, and you're not sure whether what is the exact diagnosis out of that 600 that you're dealing with, then this is very handy. If you just take those 3 lab results, what is your total IgG, what is your vaccine response, and what is your total B cell number, your CD19 count. If you just take those 3 values, we can categorize them into 4 categories. Those where it's all low or absent, that is a severe like SCID, severe combined immune deficiency, agammaglobulinemia. These patients are obviously an urgent need for immunoglobulin replacement. That patient that I spoke about, the 26-year-old that we recently had, his total IgG was 0.3. Normal for an adult, it should be above 10. And his was 0.3. So we didn't even bother to do his vaccine responses because with an IgG of under 1, you're in any case not going to measure a response. And then if IgG is low, your vaccine response is low, and you've got normal B cells, that's your CVID patient. There are some other CIDs, the combined immune deficiencies, that look like that. Hyper IgM syndrome look like that. They definitely need immunoglobulin replacement, and you need to start quickly and start early. Don't interrupt. They're going to develop bronchiectasis. This hyper IgM is going to develop liver failure. If you don't give him immunoglobulin replacement, he's going to end up with a liver transplant. Group 3 is the problem. This is the SADs, the specific antibody deficiencies. They've got normal IgG, a poor vaccine response, but normal B cells. They may benefit. So depending on their severity, you must give them IgG replacement. And then these are usually not for adult doctors. This is usually for pediatricians, class 4. So key points, they're not rare. We're getting more of them. They are often only treated with immunoglobulin replacement. More than 40% are adults. We are missing them. And they should be diagnosed because immunoglobulin replacement is cost effective. That's been proven. And if you want to read on this, this is on the ALSA website. If you go on the ALSA website, this is the strategy for replacement in South Africa that is published, and that is the official document of the Primary Immune Deficiency Working Group. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Prof. I just got some few questions. It was really exciting, and thank you so much. I appreciated it. I just wanted to, I think one of the just a question or comment regarding the PVC, the Pneumovax 23 for the vaccination. Yeah. I saw that tape a challenge to obviously give PVC 13, and then you see whether they respond. Now, my point that if you look at the EPI program, the vaccination program in South Africa, almost of the children, they already have your PVC 10.
Yes.
During the vaccination. Hence, you could actually go straight to Pneumovax because your immune system would have been primed already. But now, if you're an adult who is born in 1977, like myself, who never really had any pneumococcal vaccines.
Yeah.
So now those patients, according to our teaching at other pulmonologists, you need to give them first Prevnar 13, and then after 8 weeks, then you do Pneumovax challenge and see how they respond, and you look at the titer serotype. I don't know whether that's still or has that changed?
You know, what you're asking there is a critically important question. And we must remember here, we're using Pneumovax not to boost immunity. We're using it to test immunity. This is and therefore you should not give the Prevnar or the Synflorix before you do this. And why should you not? Because Prevnar and Synflorix and the new one that the government is using, they are conjugate vaccines. They are not pure polysaccharide vaccines. Pneumovax 23 is the only pure polysaccharide vaccine in the country. And you want to measure the polysaccharide response. So if it's a conjugate vaccine, like Prevnar, for example, they actually add tetanus to augment the response. And therefore, if you use a conjugate, you're going to get T-cell interference. And you want to see how good are these B cells at doing their job when they are exposed to polysaccharides from Moraxella, for example, or to polysaccharides that come from Haemophilus. And remember, even with pneumococcus, there are about 120 different polysaccharide antigens just within pneumococcus. And the only vaccine we've got to use for a test is Pneumovax 23. And that's why we're testing how did this B cell respond to serotype 1A? And how did this B cell respond to serotype 6A that's in the vaccine. So because of that, please don't give any of those conjugate vaccines before you give the Pneumovax. You have to start with the Pneumovax. And the only problem now is you're using Pneumovax as a test, not as a boost. And you are correct. When you want to boost, you should rather use the conjugate vaccine. But we're testing, we're not boosting, we're testing. And the only problem is once you've now done this test and you want to then boost, you must wait at least 6 months to a year before you can boost. So if you first use the Pneumovax and you now discovered that there's a problem here, then you've got a diagnosis. But you can't then use the Prevnar immediately to boost immunity. You have to wait 6 months to a year before you boost. And the other problem with this test is that you must do the time sequence correctly. So the baseline doesn't matter. A low baseline doesn't diagnose an immune deficiency. It's the response that matters. So you do the baseline with the intention to give Pneumovax. If you're not going to give Pneumovax, don't do the baseline. So you do the baseline, you give the Pneumovax, and you wait exactly 4 weeks. Don't wait 3 months. It must be 4 weeks to measure the response. And if you don't follow that sequence, you can't use Pneumovax repeatedly. This is a once-off chance that you've got. Because if you use Pneumovax over and over, you actually create susceptibility to the non-vaccine strains. So I really want to emphasize that this is a test, not boosting, and it must be done correctly.
Yeah, so no, thank you. I think that's for clarity. So I think it's really for just testing purpose. And what we have, I think our biggest problem in Pretoria is that there's lack of understanding about vaccination, actually pneumococcal. So you find every patient that walk to our rooms, they already have Pneumovax almost every year. That's been, I don't know where they got that from. But obviously, I think you're 100% right. And I think our biggest issue, of course, now, once you give it the Pneumovax, somehow there's a delay of 6 months. So the risk of invasive pneumococcal actually increases. As I said, these people are born for the era of vaccination. And I think always in the practice, what I did then done was actually to vaccinate them and then try to challenge later. But thank you for that. That's quite a lot of clarity. And the second question, I think, of course, around adult pulmonology, and I think, and I don't believe that, I mean, if you treat asthma as a pediatrician, you always get these, those who are difficult to control asthma and everything. And I actually found that actually most of these people that they classify as difficult to control asthma in South Africa, they actually having underlying immunodeficiency.
Yes.
So in midstream area, I think we did a total almost about 1,000 patients. And we actually found that almost about 60% to 55 to 60% of them actually got MBL deficiency in South Africa. So that means most of those patients actually found that actually they don't even actually have asthma. They're just having chronic recurrent cough with the hyperactive airway once you do methacholine challenge, and you find that's actually because of MBL deficiency. So the question that initially wanted really to do more further studies to see why it's so high in South Africa is a genetic mutation. And obviously we have two group of people, those with a partial deficiency and those with a complete deficiency. Those with complete deficiency were really quite small number of patients, from I think about 23% of the total deficiency. And then of course the complete deficiency is less. So the questions that, I mean, obviously looking at the medical aid discovery and everything, and currently really there's no modality actually to treat those patients apart from giving them macrolides, really long-term macrolides, and then giving maybe inhaler whenever they need them. So I don't know what's the experience on the pediatric populations, whether you see them as also an early warning from younger age, because what I've seen that I think the older the patient become, the risk of MBL deficiency actually increases. Is it because of Nansen kind of because of the aging? Or is it because really polymorphism kind of deficiency? Because we've seen that quite a lot now. What are we going to do about these patients,
So first of all, your comment on the asthma and the comorbidity of an immune deficiency, this is exactly what we're trying to do, is to break down the silos. I've showed you with specific antibody deficiency, there's a high risk of allergy. very high risk of allergy. It's not, we're working not with different silos, we're working with one phenotype. And it's even worse with selective IgA deficiency. In selective IgA deficiency that's symptomatic, 30% of patients will be allergic, 10% will develop celiac disease, and 30% will develop autoimmune diseases. So you're absolutely correct. You know, if you're dealing with this difficult to treat or severe asthmatic patient, there's definitely a case to make, especially if a wet cough or mucus or snot, chronic mucus secretions are part of the problem, to go and do an immune screen on them. I agree with that. What do we do with MBL? MBL is very common in the South African population, and that's because of our smaller genetic pool in certain parts of the population. I've already said you, the genetic carrier status in the population is high, and therefore MBL is a common problem that we're facing. MBL is a complement protein that we thought is produced in the liver. It is. That's where the main origin of it is, but epithelial cells also produce MBL. The MBL genes are active in epithelial cells. We must talk one day about the immunology of epithelial cells. It is an eye-opener. Epithelial cells are no longer not immune cells. They're active immune cells. And if you've got an MBL deficiency, fortunately, most patients are not symptomatic, but there are the symptomatic ones. It's usually the ones with an MBL of under 50 that is deficient, that's truly symptomatic. One warning about MBL, it breaks down in the test tube. So you get false low results. It's common to get false low results. We never diagnose them without at least 2 samples that show below 50 with MBL. The sample must be handled correctly.
Internet.
Sorry, Prof, we lost you there.
Are you there? You're back. So make sure they get all their polysaccharide vaccines. They're up to date with their Prevnar boost, with their Menoptra and with their meningococcal vaccines. And then, unfortunately, macrolide is the best effective treatment to give them 3 times a week. Just remember that 3 times a week macrolide causes hearing loss. Because or it may cause hearing loss. It's not deafness. It's mitochondrial fatigue of your nerve, optic nerve, and you must take breaks from it, either by taking drug holidays or switching them to something like Bactrim. So you have to alternate. You can't just keep on forever with azithromycin, or at least then, if you don't want to alternate, they must have an audiologic assessment done maybe once a year or so to make sure they lose certain frequencies. But if they're very severe, then at the end, we give them immunoglobulin replacement, although that's seldom. And fortunately, if they're adults, they're not exposed to polysaccharides as the creche kids are. So fortunately, an adult they do better than the young children. They really struggle when they're young.
Any question out there for Prof? It's getting hot here. Anybody? Marika, any comment? Yes.
Hello. No, I enjoyed the presentation a lot. We don't know everything, clearly. But you will have to excuse me. I have a dynamic function test to do now, so unfortunately I can't quiz the Prof further.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Jen.
Prof, I just have a comment. I found that IVIGE is actually more readily available in subcut IG. And I don't know why, although they say cost effectiveness, less chair time and things like that. And I've had patients who responded well and they go home and they use it at home and they come in as they need. But medical aids don't always pay for the subcut variation. They prefer us to give an immunoglobulin over 1 or 2 days rather than give them a continuous supply of subcut.
Yeah, we've actually got far more choice when it comes to subcut than intravenous. Intravenous at the moment licensed in South Africa is Polygam, and you know about the stock issues. And then intravenous, we've got Privigen. That's the 10% that's licensed, but it is very expensive. That's the biggest problem with it. Subcut in South Africa, we've got quite a choice. Intragam at the moment, stock problems, not licensed, but it works well. Berry-Globin is going out of the market. The last batch has arrived, but that's actually subcut. It's not IM. It's only IM as prophylaxis. Then we've got Gamma Norm in South Africa. We've got Cuvitru. That's a 20% in South Africa. At Steve Biko, our patients are on subcut, all of them. We in states. We don't treat them on IVIG. But there is a stock problem with the government tender at the moment, so we have to put them back. Problem is medical aid doesn't pay more than, Discovery doesn't pay more than 22,000 a month for subcut. They've made a cap, and that's about the PMB law. It used to be 15, it's now 22,000, the cap for subcut. And subcut, the imported products are more expensive than Polygam. That's the problem.
Last question, Prof. I think Darren Joseph, you raise your hand, please. You can come on.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we've seen now many patients with immune deficiencies, and as an adult, physician, they're all diagnosed in adulthood. So I think the idea that this is just a pediatric disease has to be, gotten rid of. But I've got a question. So we have a patient with CVID at the moment who had recurrent infections. I mean, every month was getting severe exacerbations to the point that she almost lost her employment. They wanted to medically board her. She then went on replacement therapy, and for just over a year or so, didn't have a single infection. She was completely in remission with the replacement. But then the medical funder wanted to stop the therapy because now she's in remission and disease is controlled with no exacerbation. So is there ever a place for stopping therapy if you get control, or is this lifelong therapy?
If it's a CVID and you followed all the diagnostic criteria, she's most likely going to be on it lifelong. It's very seldom that a CVID patient will go off treatment. In the teenagers, we do sometimes try and stop them to see what happened to their endogenous IgG production. But an adult with CVID, that's a declared CVID, and one shouldn't stop treatment. And we actually monitor their levels every. You must measure the IgG. You must set a target for the trough IgG. We measure trough IgG in our patients on a frequent basis, and for every 1 gram that you increase your trough level per liter blood, you reduce the infection burden by 17%. So let's say your trough is 8 and she's having infections, then you need to take your trough to 10 or take your trough to 12. And if you've got time, I can explain to you how we do it exactly. But we strictly work on the trough levels to determine how much the patient should get.
Yeah.
Thanks, Prof.
Any other comment from Flo, Michelle? Yeah. So, yeah, Prof, thank you. Really, it's been a very insightful discussion, and I think we should really have more of the discussion. I hope you'll become a frequent presenter in our platform, because the aim of the platform is to create more ongoing educations around Pretoria area in Africa to make sure that people can have access to this information. So I really enjoyed it. And one thing of his last question was, is there a way that probably we find a collaboration? Because I think, if you look at the healthcare system, I always say, though private sector comprises 10% of the population in the country, but I think probably that's where there's a really significant also burden of disease. Is there no way that there should be a collaboration between private sector and the government sector in doing research, because all the patients are the same, to have a look at more details, you know what I mean? To be able to do studies and publications, and perhaps through to enlighten the management of patients with asthma, either whether adult or children, to make sure there's common understanding of these chronic conditions, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we become leaders in our society, that they will actually have access to better healthcare system rather than moving from a doctor to doctor, getting these antibiotics unnecessary instead of actually addressing the underlying problem.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. First of all, I'd love to come back. I'd love to collaborate. The chair that I hold at the university is a community chair. So it's my duty to reach out to doctors who are interested and involve them. On the 13th, 14th of March in the new year, and that's, by the way, not far away, we're launching the Focus Center for Clinical Immunology at Pretoria University. That will happen at Future Africa. You are all invited. It's a 2-day launch. That's going to be, first of all, the Friday afternoon, we're going to do just refresher in basic immunology. And then the Saturday is all about the overlap, the clinical immunology, asthma. Asthma is one of the topics that we're going to discuss. Asthma overlap with immune deficiency is one of the topics that we will be doing. So I would love to have you there. And you please just send me your email addresses and I'll put you on our distribution list. We have once every 2 months on a Wednesday afternoon. It is the 5th of November, the next one. It's from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. It's online or in person. We've got a national, and we get Africa. Africa logs in. Clinical case discussion, where any doctor can bring us difficult cases and we have case discussions. On the team, we've got the transplant team, we've got geneticists, we've got people who try to do clinical immunology and the lab, and it's both private and NHLS. So we would love to involve you, and if you give your email addresses to Michelle and she gives it to me, I'll put you on our distribution list. But we would like to see you in person on the 13th of March.
That's where I'm coming from. I think we have some few fellows that we're trying to assist to train as criminologists. I think I'll also invite them. And really, I think for me, it's excitement. I think education is everything. So would be nice to have that. And I think we'll definitely come with a team. Michelle will have all our emails. And yeah, I think we're looking forward. And I think next year, we're going to put you on one of few slots. I think maybe to share our immunology platform to make sure that we really reach out to the older, because adult immunology, we're too busy, but I think it would be nice for us to focus. I really love immunology and I'd like to do more on it. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.